I used to think my parents loved my son. Until one evening I opened his backpack and found a drawing. A man holding a broom, a child curled up in a closet. I wanted to believe it was imagination, but the hidden camera showed me the truth, my father calling him trash, forcing him to scrub the toilet with a toothbrush, and my mother sitting there sipping tea, watching him clean his cousin's feet. That was the day I cut off their support, and the day they declared war, suing me for custody. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to witness real stories you won't be able to look away from. Before everything shattered, I truly believed that leaving my son with his grandparents was the safest choice. But some wounds, if left unseen, only spread deeper. My name is Celeste. I'm 38. I'm an architect in Seattle. I build things, homes, spaces, lives. I draw lines that protect people, create boundaries, structure. But somehow the lines I drew in my own family, they were always blurred. I used to believe my parents adored their grandson. Truly. I believed they saw in him what they couldn't see in me, innocence, potential softness. And perhaps I wanted to believe it so badly. I ignored the cracks in the floor beneath us. It wasn't until last fall on a rain-heavy Tuesday that the illusion shattered. Leo. My son. My 7-year-old son forgot to empty his school bag that night. A small, unzipped folder slid out onto the kitchen floor while he was brushing his teeth. I picked it up absent-mindedly, thinking it was another one of his math assignments. But it wasn't math. It was a drawing. Crayon on white paper. Harsh lines, fast strokes. In the center, a stick-figure man with a wide, angry mouth holding what looked unmistakably like a broom or stick. The man's eyebrows were black slashes, his fists square. Above him, jagged words, "Clean or else." To the right of the figure, smaller, curling into itself, was another childlike figure hiding behind what appeared to be a door. The words beneath it were uneven, shaky. "Don't find me, I'm good." I stared at it far too long. It was crude, yes, like a child's drawing always is. But this wasn't pretend. This wasn't monster under the bed fantasy. This was fear. Real bone-deep fear. I didn't want to believe what it meant. Not fully. But I couldn't look away either. So I asked Leo gently, "Hey, sweetie, who's this in the picture?" He glanced at it, then at me, blinked once. "No one," he muttered. That was lie number 1, and I knew it. His voice was too quick, too rehearsed. I didn't press. I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew more. And that's when something darker stirred in me, a version of myself I hadn't felt in decades. The girl I used to be. The girl who learned to tell perfect lies just to survive one more day without punishment. I stared at the drawing long after Leo went to sleep. I sat on the floor, the crayon colors bleeding into my eyes. And all I could think was, what else have I missed? The next morning, I didn't drop Leo off like usual. I asked my assistant to reschedule meetings. I had one mission: clarity. Before breakfast, I tucked a tiny button camera into a mesh pocket inside Leo's backpack. He didn't notice. I smiled through it, kissed his forehead, and told him to have fun at Grandma and Grandpa's. The guilt of betrayal tore at my stomach, but something worse was rising doubt. Later that night, long after I picked him up and tucked him in, I sat at my desk. My fingers hovered over the mouse, hesitant. Then I pressed play. The footage was jerky at first, a blur of playground chatter and seatbelt clicks. Then stillness. Silence. Leo's backpack abandoned near the couch. Off in the distance, voices. At first it was faint. My mother instructing him to remove his shoes. "Don't track dirt in Leo." Then my father's voice. "Bathroom, go scrub the rim, and don't half-ass it like last time." I froze. Then came a pause. The sound of Leo's soft footsteps, too obedient. The rattle of a bucket. A long silence punctuated by the rustle of paper. My cousin Samantha's voice cut through sharp and dismissive. Make sure you say yes, ma'am, this time, like I told you. A few seconds passed. Then Leo again, voice timid, small. Yes, ma'am. I shut my laptop. Then I opened it again. I needed to see it all. The footage rolled. My father was in the hallway now, his shadow massive, taking up the frame. That's not clean, he snapped. Your mother spoiled you, that's the problem. All softness, no spine. There was a slap. Not skin on skin, but something hit a surface. A door. A wall. My mother's voice followed. Flat, unbothered. Just make sure he doesn't touch the cutlery after scrubbing. Laughter. Samantha's again. She was eating something, cookies maybe, and speaking between chews. Can I call him the help? It's funny. No one stopped her. The screen shook slightly as Leo moved. You could hear his breath getting faster. Closer to the camera now, probably checking on his bag, maybe hoping for an escape. And then, the moment that broke me. My father leaned over, yelling so close to the mic it crackled. Your mom thinks money fixes everything, but not here, not under my roof. Here you learn work. You earn your space. Earn your space. That was it. That sentence snapped something in me that had been rusted shut for 30 years. I saw myself again, age 8, scrubbing the same tile floor, my knees bleeding because I wasn't allowed to use the mop. I saw my mother's slippers step over me without looking down. I heard my sister being praised in the background for learning a new dance move while I was told, "You'll be useful someday, if you learn to listen." That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling until the ceiling stared back, and then I walked to my closet. Dug deep past the blazers and blueprints, found the box I swore I'd never open. Inside one photograph, one broken metal key, and a letter I'd written to myself at 16. The photograph showed me barefoot, broom in hand, scrubbing the patio, while my cousin lounged with a popsicle. The same cousin who now treated Leo like a servant. The key belonged to a small metal lock that used to be on my bedroom door. Not to keep people out, but to keep me in. I ran my fingers over the teeth of that key, cold and jagged. This wasn't about one incident, one drawing, one slap of words. This was generational. It had never stopped. I had just pretended it did because pretending was easier. Because the truth meant confronting the very people I had once convinced myself I still needed. I sat on the edge of my bed with the video paused on Leo's small, hunched back. He was wiping the floor one square at a time, his shoulders shaking in silence, not crying, not wailing, just collapsing inward. Quiet pain is the kind that takes longest to notice and longest to heal. I whispered into the room like a vow. It ends with me, because I wasn't just protecting my son anymore. I was protecting the girl I used to be, the one no one stood up for. And for the first time in my life, I chose her. At exactly 7:01 the next morning, I opened my laptop with a sense of finality I hadn't known the night before. I logged into the portal for Coastal Federal Bank, my parents' mortgage lender, where a single blinking line greeted me, recurring transfer $2,000 month active. 4 years, 48 months, nearly $100,000 I had wired into their account without delay, quietly, consistently, out of guilt, out of habit, out of some desperate hope that love could be bought in monthly increments. But I wasn't buying love anymore. I hovered the mouse over the cancel button. My finger twitched just slightly, a flicker of hesitation. Then, like a blade finally meeting flesh, I clicked. Transfer canceled. No fireworks, no alert, just silence. A clean mechanical severing. And with it, something inside me gave way, like an old rope snapped from strain, unraveling with a tired sigh. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. I wasn't crying, not yet. It was the kind of silence that came with decision, a full stop. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't dial out of anger, not grief. It was something else, like lighting a match in a cold room, necessary and final. My father picked up on the second ring. Celeste, Don't touch Leo again. I didn't say hello, didn't ask how he was, just that. 4 words, steady, controlled. A pause. He sounded like he hadn't quite registered it yet. What are you talking about? I saw the video, I said. Every second, every word, every order barked at him like he was, "Watch your tone, girl." He snapped, his voice sharpening like it always had when he felt cornered. You don't get to accuse me like that after everything we've done for you. I didn't flinch. You don't get to talk to him like that ever again. Another pause longer this time. I could almost hear the shift, the anger rising beneath his skin. You ungrateful brat, he growled. We raised you, fed you, sacrificed for you, and this is what we get. Threats. It's not a threat, I said quietly. It's a boundary. Then came the real storm. You think you're better than us now, don't you? With your fancy job and city apartment and nanny schedules, all that success. Don't forget who carried you through college, who kept a roof over your head when you were sick with strep throat and couldn't go to daycare. We paid your way and now you cut us off. There it was. The truth slick with rage and entitlement. They'd never seen my support as love, just a balance sheet. I held the phone slightly away, letting his voice blare into the air hollow and explosive. And when the rant hit its peak, I brought the phone back. You don't get to weaponize the past against me anymore, I said. I'm not 8. I'm not trapped. You're turning him against us, he hissed. No, I said. You did that yourself. I ended the call. 10 minutes later, my mother rang. I let it ring until voicemail, then again and again. By the 3rd call, I answered not because I was ready, but because I wanted her to know I wasn't hiding. Her voice was trembling, but not with sadness. Disbelief. Betrayal. That particular cocktail only mothers could summon. Celeste. She started in that breathy tone she always used before saying something cutting. This is not how families handle disagreements. It's not a disagreement, Mom. It's a pattern, and I'm ending it. A beat of silence, then the shift. I knew that job of yours would turn you cold. I told your father this would happen. Too much ambition in a woman, it rots the heart. I almost laughed. Almost. You let him humiliate my son, Diane, I said, using her name like a weapon. You sat at that kitchen table and watched Leo scrub floors. What kind of heart does that take? You're twisting things, she said, suddenly sharp. We're old-fashioned Celeste. We believe in structure, in discipline, not coddling. You believe in cruelty disguised as control, and you're not going to pass it on to Leo, not while I'm breathing. You can't keep him from us. Watch me. I hung up. There were no apologies, no replays, just the steady echo of severed lines ringing in my ears like the aftermath of an explosion. I took a walk. Rain slicked the sidewalks, making the city shimmer like glass. I breathed in the wet scent of pine and diesel blinking hard, as if the tears were just raindrops clinging to my lashes. But when I got back to my apartment, the email was waiting. Subject line: legal custody concern. Initial filing. Sent by a lawyer. Not theirs yet, but someone they had apparently consulted. They were planning to sue me for joint custody of Leo. Their angle. That I was an absentee mother. That Leo had been left in their care too often. That I took business trips, traveled alone, left my child with elderly caretakers. And that perhaps now Leo was best suited in a home where he would receive proper attention and family support. I read it twice, then sat back. They were going to try to take my son, not out of love, out of revenge. I had embarrassed them, exposed them, cut the cord, and like all narcissists backed into a corner, they were now swinging wildly with claws bared. For a moment, fear returned. The girl in me shrank, remembering nights of silence, of hearing footsteps down the hallway, and wondering if she'd said too much. But then I stood up, walked to the drawer in my home office, opened the mahogany file labeled legal, and pulled out the envelope I had printed the night before. Inside, a full transcript of the video recording, time-stamped, clear. I also included photos of Leo's drawing. my journal entries cataloging the subtle changes in his behavior over the past 6 months. The documented therapy notes from his school counselor expressing concern over anxiety triggers after time with grandparents. I took the folder and drove to the office of Diane Keller, family attorney, recommended by a colleague. No nonsense. Former child welfare prosecutor. The office smelled like peppermint and old paper. A quiet receptionist offered me water. I declined. When Diane emerged, she had glasses that magnified her blue eyes and a presence like iron beneath silk. "You must be Celeste," she said. "Let's talk about what you're up against." I sat my fingers clenched, my chest tight. "I think my parents are going to sue for custody of my son," I said. "And I need to be ready." She nodded once calm. "Tell me everything." And so I did. 45 minutes later, Diane pushed the folder toward the center of the desk, nodding as she reviewed the content. "You're already one step ahead," she said. "They'll try to paint you as absent, but these materials suggest emotional abuse. Clear patterns. Intent. Supervision failure." I swallowed hard. "Will that be enough?" "It will if we stay focused," she replied. "This isn't about winning points. It's about proving protection. Leo's well-being is the only thing the court will care about. And right now, you're the only one prioritizing that." I leaned back and breathed. The rope was gone. I wasn't hanging by it anymore. I was holding it, controlling it. I nodded. "Then let's begin." At 14:01 on a rainy Thursday morning, I walked into King County Family Court with the kind of calm that only comes after everything inside you has already shattered once. This wasn't a mediation. This was war disguised as legality. My parents had filed a formal petition for partial custody of Leo. The papers used legal language, but their message was sharp and personal. Celeste Morgan is an emotionally unavailable absentee parent. Her child would benefit from the consistent presence of his stable retired grandparents. They painted a version of me that barely resembled the woman who had been folding dinosaur pajamas and cutting crusts off sandwiches for 7 years. In their story, I was a high-functioning ghost present in paperwork, but absent in presence. And worse, they wrapped their cruelty in righteousness. The waiting room smelled like overbrewed coffee and carpet cleaner. Families passed like slow shadows, some teary-eyed, others stone-faced. I sat by the window legs crossed tightly, clutching my file of evidence like a lifeline. Across the room, my mother dabbed under her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the same kind she'd used at my piano recital when I was 11, the one where I played the wrong chord and was told afterward, well, at least Kimberly didn't embarrass herself. Next to her, my father sat with both hands on his knees, leaning forward slightly, as if this were a chess match, and he already had his winning move prepared. We were called in at 15:17. A temporary judge presided. Female, mid-40s, sharp gaze. The kind of woman who had seen hundreds of fractured families try to sew themselves back together with legal thread. "Mrs. Morgan." She addressed my mother first, scanning the petition. "You're requesting shared custodial rights over your grandson Leo Morgan. Please explain your reasoning." My mother's voice wavered not with weakness but practiced vulnerability. "Your Honor, my grandson needs stability. My daughter, while successful, travels frequently for work. Leo has been in our care for years. He knows our home, our rhythm. We provide him with values, structure, love." My father nodded emphatically. "And you believe Ms. Morgan," the judge turned to me briefly, then back to them, "is incapable of providing those things?" "I believe she tries," my mother replied, folding her hands. "But she treats motherhood like a side project. She's busy, always delegating. We're simply here to help." "Help!" I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. Then, as if on cue, my mother's voice broke beautifully theatrically. "Celeste's never bonded with Leo like a mother should. I've done most of the raising. She once left him with us for 8 straight days while attending a design expo in Berlin. A pause. Because she forgot his passport. I breathed slowly. Let her finish. The judge turned to me. Ms. Morgan, your response? I stood. I'm a single parent, I said. I work hard. I provide Leo with everything he needs, including affection, safety, and consistency. The reason he stayed with them in the past was because I believed he was safe there. I was wrong. I paused, looking directly at my parents. And I have evidence. The room shifted. My lawyer slid a folder forward, transcripts, drawings, therapy notes, the video. Your Honor, Diane said calmly. We have documentation of emotional mistreatment occurring in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, including recorded interactions where the child was demeaned, forced to clean unsupervised, and subjected to hostile verbal discipline far beyond what is considered appropriate. The judge nodded once. We'll hear from the child next. Leo had been waiting in a separate room with a social worker and court advocate. He didn't know we were in court, just that he was going to talk to a lady about his home time. At 17:05, I watched through one-way glass as Leo sat across from the court advocate. He fiddled with the zipper of his hoodie. Leo, the woman said softly, do you like going to your grandparents' house? He didn't speak at first. Sometimes he said finally, why just sometimes? Leo hesitated. Then his voice dropped so low I barely heard it. I only get hugs when I do what they say. If I'm quiet, they smile more. If I talk too much, they get mad. Who gets mad, sweetie? Grandpa. He says I talk like my mom and that's not a good thing. I pressed my palm flat to the glass. What do you like about your mom's house? I get to just be me there. He paused again, looking at his hands. At Grandma's house, I have to be better, but I don't know how to do that. Do you want to keep going there, Leo? He shook his head. Only if Mom comes too. The woman smiled gently. Thank you, Leo. That's very helpful. He stood, and when he walked out, he looked right at me through the glass. Not directly, but like a child sensing heat in a room. His eyes met mine for 1 second. I mouthed, I love you. He nodded once, quietly brave. Back in the courtroom, the advocate relayed her summary to the judge. Leo expressed confusion and anxiety when describing his grandparents' home. He doesn't feel emotionally safe. The child has clearly bonded with his mother, and from a psychological standpoint, separation from her would cause more harm. The room went still. My mother turned to whisper something to my father, who shook his head sharply, his jaw clenched. Then came the judge's voice. We will not be granting joint custody. The child remains in sole custody of Ms. Morgan. Visitation by the petitioners will be suspended pending further psychological review. A gavel. A verdict. A beginning. But not the end. As we left the courtroom, I paused just outside the heavy double doors. My breath caught. My knees wobbled slightly. And just when I thought the adrenaline would let go, the memory hit me. Age 9. Report card day. I had earned all A's except 1 B+ in math. My father hadn't yelled. He had simply taken my plate at dinner and placed it in the sink. No dessert for mediocrity, he'd said. That night I was locked in my room. Not as punishment, but to encourage reflection. The room was cold. Dark. I remember tracing the patterns in the wallpaper and naming each flower so I wouldn't cry. My mother didn't come in until morning. I had never told anyone that story. Not a therapist, not a friend, not even myself, really. Not until that moment outside the courtroom where the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the air felt far too thin. Leo would never know that room. I would make sure of it. The generational door was closed. But now, for the first time in my life, I held the key. The session started like all the others. Warm lighting, soft cushions, a jar of colored pencils in the corner, just in case Leo wanted to draw instead of speak. But today he spoke. At 21:01, I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. Dr. Rayner's door opened slowly. I looked up, heart caught somewhere in my throat. Celeste, she said gently. Can I talk to you before Leo comes out? I stood, legs braced. This was never a good sign. In her office, she motioned to the same chair I always used, the one near the shelf of toys I pretended not to notice. She waited until the door clicked shut. "He told me something today," she began. He was hesitant but clear. I nodded silent. Leo said that during visits to his grandparents, his grandfather called him, quote, "stupid and lazy like your mom." He was made to clean the staircase with a toothbrush. My spine stiffened, but my face stayed still. He said if he missed a spot, he had to start over. My jaw locked. He also mentioned that Grandma sat nearby while it happened. He said she pretended to be reading a magazine, but he saw her watching. There was a ringing in my ears, like air pressure had shifted in the room. Dr. Rayner leaned forward. "Celeste, this isn't discipline. This is degradation. Leo is beginning to internalize it. He told me, I guess I'm not good at anything unless I'm quiet." I closed my eyes. I had heard that sentence before, only it hadn't come from Leo. It had come from me, at age 10, whispered into a pillow after a day of being ignored because I interrupted a conversation at the dinner table. Dr. Rayner continued, "We're documenting everything. You've done the right thing by keeping him away, but I wanted you to hear this directly." I nodded, holding back the quake building beneath my ribs. "Can I see him now?" She smiled softly. "He's drawing. He said he's making a picture of a house with no yelling." That night, after Leo fell asleep in his fort blanket on the couch, I poured a glass of wine and called Clara. She picked up before the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call," she said. "I need a favor," I replied, "not a small one." Clara didn't hesitate. "Anything. I need you to talk to someone." "A neighbor. Our old next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hendricks. She still lives there. She was always home, always heard things." There was a pause. "You mean she heard them yelling at you?" Clara said. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Clara inhaled sharply. "Send me the address. I'll go tomorrow." "Clara, Celeste, you're protecting Leo. This is no longer about comfort. It's about truth." The next morning, Clara texted me a single line. "You need to hear this yourself." She had recorded the conversation. I sat in my car engine off parked in the garage. My hands trembled as I hit play. Mrs. Hendricks' voice, still sharp, still clear, echoed through the speakers. "Oh, honey, of course I remember. Your father had a temper like a snapped power line. I used to press a pillow to the wall when he'd start yelling so I wouldn't hear it. But I always did. That house wasn't insulated for secrets." A pause, then she continued. "And your mother? Well, she wasn't innocent either. I saw her once shoving Celeste back into the house by her shoulder because she'd tried to leave barefoot. Said, 'You don't get to walk out until you fix what you broke.' I don't even think Celeste had broken anything." Clara's voice entered. "Would you be willing to sign a written statement?" Mrs. Hendricks hesitated only a second. "If it helps the girl and her boy, absolutely." When the recording ended, I sat frozen. I had lived most of my adult life pretending my childhood was difficult but not abusive, that it was structured, strict, tough love, as my mother always called it. But now the language was shifting. The veil was lifting, and the word I'd spent decades avoiding was taking shape in the air. Abuse. And I wasn't the only one who saw it now. That night, I dug through an old file box in the back of my closet. Inside were tax returns, expired leases, yellowing photos, and a sealed manila envelope I hadn't touched in 12 years. It was a human resources letter marked confidential from a community center where my father had worked part-time as a youth mentor when I was in college. He had been let go. The letter was brief but blunt, due to multiple complaints of aggressive behavior, including one documented incident involving physical intimidation of a minor participant. "We are terminating your engagement, effective immediately." The name of the complainant had been redacted. I remembered the day I found that envelope. My mother had called me in tears, begging me to not believe the rumors. She had told me my father was too passionate with the kids, that someone had misinterpreted his intentions. I had believed her. At least I'd pretended to. But reading the letter now, seeing the truth typed out, unemotional, unrelenting, I felt a familiar nausea curl in my stomach. They hadn't just failed with me. They had continued, and I had been funding them to do it. At 26 Hosrud that night, I sat at my desk, opened my digital journal, and typed slowly. My hands ached, my chest hollow. I used to think if I moved far enough away, made enough money, built enough walls, physical or emotional, I would be free. But trauma doesn't care about zip codes. It lives in the air ducts, in your habits, in the way you flinch when someone raises their voice in a restaurant. I built skyscrapers for other people and couldn't even renovate the basement inside myself. The truth is, I never left that house. I only changed the furniture. And I never escaped that basement, not really, until now. I closed the laptop. The room was still. Leo stirred in his sleep on the couch, mumbling something about dinosaurs and chocolate milk. I walked over and pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He didn't wake. The rope that had tethered me to that past, to that house, to the silent contract of generational obedience had begun to fray. And this time I wasn't afraid to let it snap. It was the second hearing. The one that counted. The one where silence would no longer be enough. By 28:01, I stood before the court with every ounce of truth I had stitched together. The judge looked tired. Maybe she always did. Or maybe the weight of families coming undone in her courtroom day after day had taught her to brace her heart behind neutral eyes. I didn't have that luxury, not anymore. "Ms. Morgan," the judge said, adjusting her glasses, "you may proceed with your evidence." My attorney Diane rose first, her presence calm but unyielding. "Your Honor, today we present multiple forms of documentation supporting the claim that Leo Morgan has experienced emotional mistreatment in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Morgan." I didn't breathe as the first item was introduced. The video. It played on a courtroom monitor, large, cold, irrefutable. There was Leo, small. Too small for what he was holding. A toothbrush in one hand, a bucket in the other, kneeling on the bottom stair. My father's voice thundered in the background. "Do it right or do it again. Stop acting like your mother." Someone in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Next, the transcript, Leo's exact words during therapy. "He says I talk too much, so I'm not smart. He says I'll never be strong like my cousins." Then the drawing. I hadn't wanted to share it at first. It felt sacred. A visual cry from a child who didn't know the vocabulary of trauma yet. But it mattered. It showed a boy hiding behind a door and a man with a stick drawn 3 times his size. The words scrawled above, "Don't find me. I'm good." The judge studied it for a long time. Then came Mrs. Hendricks's signed statement. She wasn't present, but her words rang through. "I witnessed repeated instances of screaming, belittling, and punitive treatment. The child did not appear safe." I glanced at my parents. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly his ears were pink. My mother still composed, but her fingers twitched on the bench. The judge turned. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, do you have a response to this evidence?" My father stood. "Yes, Your Honor, we absolutely do." His voice echoed in the chamber. "These are half-truths, taken out of context. That boy is being brainwashed." "By whom?" the judge asked. He pointed. "By her. Celeste has been poisoning him against us. She's been planting ideas, making us villains, so she can justify keeping him all to herself." My mother stood too. "Leo is confused," she added, her voice tight with restraint. "He's being coached to remember things that never happened the way they're being described." My hands balled into fists beneath the table. Then my father leaned forward and said it what I'd feared but expected. "He's lying." Silence fell like a sheet of glass. The words hung in the air, heavy, jagged. "He's 7, I said aloud slowly. "He doesn't even know how to lie that well yet. But you're seasoned." My father's face flushed red. "Watch your mouth." "No," I said, standing. And then I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. I wasn't going to read this, but I think it's time. I opened it. A letter, written in pencil on wide-ruled paper. Spelling errors still present. Leo's signature crooked at the bottom. I cleared my throat. "Dear grown-ups," I began. Please stop talking about me like I'm a toy. I am not a toy. I don't want to be traded or shared. I want to live in a house where I can laugh and not get in trouble, where I can make a mess and someone helps me clean it. I want to love my family, but not if they only love me when I'm quiet. I love Grandma and Grandpa, but I don't like how they make me feel like I'm bad when I'm not. Mom tells me I'm good even when I spill things. She says I don't have to earn love. I don't want to be a thing people argue about. I am not a thing. Please let me stay home. Love, Leo. By the time I finished, the courtroom was still again, but this time with something else, something heavier. The truth had settled. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any rebuttal. At 34 Boundary, the judge looked down at the paperwork before her and then back up at us. Her voice was even, final. The request for partial custody filed by Mr. and Mrs. Morgan is hereby denied. Custody remains solely with Ms. Celeste Morgan. Further visitation rights are suspended pending psychological review and family therapy participation. A gavel, one knock, and suddenly the courtroom wasn't cold anymore. Diane put a hand on my shoulder. I didn't even realize I was crying until the warmth of her hand steadied me. Leo wasn't a thing. He was my son, and he was going home for good. It started as most reckoning does with silence. Then came the letters. At 3501, my parents received official notice from the bank their mortgage account was delinquent. Their home, my childhood prison wrapped in suburban siding, was now a liability on paper, a red mark in some quiet ledger they couldn't manipulate with guilt. The automatic payments I had once set up like ritual clockwork had stopped. The well they'd drunk from for 4 years had gone dry overnight. They must have stared at the envelope in stunned silence at first, but by the second letter, followed by a sharp voicemail from the loan officer, it became clear the money wasn't coming. Not this time. I received the first call from my father at 3700. He didn't open with hello. Celeste, he said, his voice stripped of its usual thunder. We need to talk. Urgently. I said nothing. Let him continue. The bank is threatening foreclosure. The taxes are due. Your mother's blood pressure is through the roof. We're under pressure here. I stayed silent. We raised you, he continued, the edge returning to his voice. You don't just cut family off like this. It's not right. I still didn't speak. Celeste, he said like a command this time. You hear me? I ended the call. 3 minutes later, a text lit up my screen. It was from my mother. You can't do this to us. We're your parents. We gave you life. You don't walk away from people who carried you for 9 months. You just don't. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the manipulation that got me. It was how casually she believed biology still gave her access to my soul. As if that womb had come without scars. I didn't respond. Not to the call. Not to the text. Instead, I opened my closet. Tucked between old sketchbooks and a box of Leo's toddler shoes was a small wooden keepsake box. The kind people gift for anniversaries or safekeepings. Inside, carefully wrapped in the corner of a yellowed washcloth, was a key. Silver. Scratched. Slightly bent at the teeth. I hadn't held it in years. It used to lock the old storage room in our basement. The place where I was sent when I talked too loud, laughed too hard, or God forbid spilled something on the rug. They called it the reflection room. There was no window. Just the musty smell of old coats and a chair with one leg shorter than the others. I sat there for hours at a time, once overnight. This key had been in my coat pocket the day I left for college. I took it by accident, at first, then on purpose. A trophy, a warning, a promise to myself that I'd never be locked inside anything ever again. At 38:30, I placed the key in a new envelope. No return address. Just a white card folded once inside. I didn't sign my name. Just wrote, "This is yours. You locked me in, remember? Keep it or use it. One choice continues the past. The other ends it." I sealed the envelope, walked it to the corner mailbox, and dropped it in without ceremony. No one saw me. No one needed to. Some messages don't need confrontation to be heard. They just need to arrive. I don't know how they reacted when they received it. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they cried. Maybe they didn't understand what it was. At first, turning the key over in their hands, feeling the weight of it, with old fingers that had long forgotten what it meant. But I hoped deep down that something in them cracked. That something in them remembered. Not the details. The impact. The sound of a girl too young to know silence wasn't safety too smart to accept punishment as love. At 41:30, I recorded a voice memo in my phone, just for me, just to hear it said out loud. The key was never the threat. The door never kept me in. It was the belief that I deserved to be there. That's what they taught me. And now I've handed it back. They can hang it up as decoration, or use it to finally open something in themselves. That's the thing about keys, they don't promise change. They offer the choice. Stay locked in denial or face the mess. But I'm no longer in that room. And I'm not coming back to rescue anyone from theirs. I paused, then added quietly, the key is yours now, but the door isn't mine to open anymore. Click. Save. Close. And for the first time in my life, I felt unburdened. At 42:01, the story went public. A local human interest segment aired the headline like it was some salacious family drama grandparents sue daughter for custody lose. The photo they used was an old one of me from a firm gala, smiling in black chiffon. Below it, a grainy image of my parents taken from a neighbor's porch, probably standing on their porch looking confused and bruised in pride. They didn't mention Leo's name. For that I was thankful. But the comment section didn't hold back. Entitled Millennial cuts off loving parents. If she was really abused, why'd she let her kid go there? Another career woman too good for family. Yet, interspersed between the noise were voices that didn't sound like strangers at all. I grew up in a house like that. It never leaves you. My grandmother locked me in the garage once when I spilled milk. Protecting your child is loving your family, even when it hurts. The court case had ended, but the judgment of society had only just begun. By 43:30, I stopped reading articles and started focusing on Leo. Dr. Rayner referred us to a trauma-informed art therapist named Nita, whose office smelled like orange peels and cedar. Leo went in once a week, sometimes twice. He didn't talk much the first few sessions, but he drew. In his 5th session, he placed a crayon drawing in my lap as I waited in the lobby. It wasn't a house this time. Not really. It was a box with windows wide open. No bars, no gray scribbles. Inside, a child at a table. Books stacked high. Sunlight streaming through a drawn skylight. No red, no black, no eraser marks. Just yellow, blue, green. When I asked him what it was, he shrugged. A place with no yelling, he said. I want to live there forever. I looked up, eyes glassy. You do, sweetheart, I whispered. You already do. At 4500, an unexpected message arrived. From Kimberly, my cousin. The same one who used to tease me behind closed doors and mimic my mother's voice for laughs. She hadn't spoken to me in over a decade. Her message was short. Tao hiểu rồi. That was it. No punctuation, but it landed heavier than full paragraphs. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if she meant it, if she remembered, if she too had lived in the shadows of comparison. We'd both been fed from the same table of emotional starvation. I had been told I wasn't enough. She'd been told she was the only one who was. We both lost. Two sides of the same blade. I didn't reply, not yet. Instead, I scrolled through her photos, a boy and a girl about Leo's age, birthday parties, ice cream at the beach. But in one photo, something caught me. A child, her son, sitting rigid at a dinner table. The caption read, Sunday lunch with Grandma and Grandpa. His smile didn't reach his eyes. At 47:00, Kimberly texted again. Ethan asked me yesterday if it's okay to laugh during dinner at their house. Said last week he was told he was being dramatic. I felt my throat tighten. He said Aunt Diane stared at him so long he forgot how to chew. There it was, the ripple. I wasn't the only one. Leo wasn't the only one. This wasn't an isolated house of pain. It was a web, carefully spun, generational, reinforced through silent dinners and sharp glances and praise withheld like air. Ethan had no idea he'd just opened the next chapter of this story, and I had no intention of letting it close without change. I called Kimberly. For the first time in years, she answered on the first ring. We didn't start with apologies. We started with breath. And then she said I thought I was the favorite. But maybe I was just better at staying quiet. My hand trembled as I pressed the phone to my ear. Maybe we both were, I said. There was no explosion, no fireworks, just two women raised by wolves finally comparing scars. In the background, I heard her daughter laughing. Not forced, not filtered, just laughing. And I let myself hope, for the first time in a long time, that maybe healing wasn't just a destination. Maybe it was a wave, and we had finally stopped swimming against it. At 49:01, the envelope arrived not with venom this time, but with pleading. A neatly worded petition filed through the court requesting monthly supervised visitation rights. Not custody, not co-parenting, just time, an hour or two, once a month. Family bonds should not be severed permanently, the letter argued. Leo deserves to know where he comes from. It was the first time they acknowledged him as more than a bargaining chip. But I didn't trust words anymore. Not alone. I responded through legal counsel with 3 conditions. 1. Mandatory therapy participation for both of them with documentation. 2. Weekly reflective journaling submitted to their therapist to explore behavioral history and impact. 3. All visits would take place in a public setting supervised by a neutral observer until further notice. At 51:30, my attorney forwarded their reply. They had agreed. Reluctantly, yes, but agreed. And so the park was chosen. Neutral ground, wide open sky, plenty of eyes. I arrived early with Leo. He wore his blue hoodie and held a dandelion he refused to part with. Why here, he asked. So it feels safe, I answered. For me or for them? I smiled. Both. When they arrived, I watched from a bench under the trees far enough to avoid interfering close enough to act if needed. My father wore a blazer that didn't quite fit anymore. My mother carried a tote bag. They approached slowly. No outstretched arms, no theatrics. Just careful steps and surprisingly gentle eyes. Leo stood still like a bird unsure of landing. My mother knelt, revealing the contents of her bag. A red apple and a paperback book. Nothing flashy, no toys or candy or thinly veiled attempts to buy forgiveness. Just a simple offering. We thought maybe you'd like this, she said. Leo took the apple, turned it in his hands, then looked at the book. Charlotte's Web. I saw his brow furrow, curious, cautious. Then came his voice, quiet but certain. Thanks, he said, but I can read it myself now. No bitterness, just fact. My father opened his mouth maybe to correct him or say something rote and paternal, but he stopped. Instead, he nodded. Leo turned and sat on the grass, flipping the book open. They sat nearby, not beside him, not over him, just near. No scolding, no jokes at his expense, just presence. And for the first time, I didn't feel my chest tighten. At 55:30, I realized my hands weren't shaking. I was watching my parents within 10 feet of my son and not bracing for damage. It was like witnessing a rare animal in the wild. Beautiful, tentative, and still too early to believe in its survival. But something had changed. They hadn't earned back trust. Not yet. But they had shown up differently. And Leo had spoken not to appease, not to avoid punishment, but from a place of clarity. Thank you, but I can read it myself now. The bloodline remained. But the power dynamic, that had shifted. And in that shift, a choice had been made. Maybe even the beginning of something real. The conference hall was modest folding chairs, soft-lit chandeliers, a pitcher of water with lemon slices floating idly. The banner overhead read, "Breaking the Legacy, Healing from Toxic Parenting." Celeste stood in the middle of the circle, no podium, no barrier, just space and a dozen quiet faces. Some had their arms crossed. Others clutched notebooks or worry stones. Every person in that room carried something they hadn't named aloud in years. Celeste exhaled. My name is Celeste. I'm an architect, and I'm a mother. A few nods. And I'm the daughter of two people who never learned how to love without conditions. At 56:45, the words cracked her throat, but not her resolve. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, succeeded loudly enough, sent enough checks, visited on holidays, forgave quietly, then maybe I'd finally be treated like a daughter, not a debt. The room was silent. I left my son with them. I thought they'd be softer with him. I was wrong. By 58 hours, she had pulled something from her coat pocket. A key, rusty, dull silver. The kind that once opened a forgotten door. She held it up. This is from the basement of my childhood home. The door I was locked behind every time I cried too loudly or brought home a bee. Whispers rippled. I sent it to my parents after they lost a custody case. Not as revenge, but as a mirror. She passed the key around the circle. Because sometimes healing isn't about slamming the door behind you. It's about naming the room you were kept in and choosing to walk out. At 6000 across the city, Leo raised his hand. The classroom buzzed with pre-lunch restlessness. Miss Eng, his teacher, paused mid-sentence on the whiteboard. Yes, Leo. He stood, not pushed, not prompted, just stood. The answer is 11. Some kids giggled. A few clapped ironically. Leo sat back down. No one corrected him. Because the answer was 11. But even if it hadn't been, he still would have smiled. He told me about it that night over grilled cheese. I didn't even feel nervous, he said. I asked why. Because I wasn't scared of being wrong, he said. I just wanted to try. At 62:30, I sat beside him, running a thumb gently down the back of his hand. That night, I opened my old notebook, the one from therapy pages, curled at the edges, trauma-inked in shaky cursive. And I wrote a sentence I'd never dared to believe until now. My child does not need to be extraordinary. He only needs to be safe while he is still clumsy. And that would be enough. At 63:01, there was a knock at the door. Not hesitant, not forceful, just steady. When Celeste opened it, Kimberly stood there. The same cousin who once smirked behind her mother's shoulder, echoing rules she was too young to understand. But today she wasn't alone. Beside her was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5, wearing yellow overalls and mismatched socks. Her name's Junie, Kimberly said. Celeste invited them in, made tea, turned off the television. The air carried a quiet anticipation. They sat on the living room floor. No distractions, just steam rising from ceramic cups and the weight of what needed to be said. I used to think I had it easier than you, Kimberly began. But I didn't. I just didn't notice the cracks until I heard them in Junie's voice. At 64 she looked down at her daughter. She flinched when I raised my voice. I wasn't yelling at her, just yelling. That was enough. Celeste nodded slowly. The recognition in her eyes wasn't judgment, it was shared memory. I don't want to pass it down, Kimberly whispered. I want to be the one who ends it. By 6500, they hugged not as relatives, but as survivors, as architects of a new foundation. That weekend, Leo turned 8. The yard was filled with sun and balloons and uncoordinated dancing. Celeste had baked the cake herself, slightly uneven, but topped with bright blue frosting that spelled "You are enough." At 6600, the guests arrived in waves. Clara brought hand-painted cards. The neighbor kids brought noise. And to Celeste's surprise, her parents arrived too. Not uninvited, but still unexpected. No gifts, just a large wrapped rectangle carried between them like something fragile. Leo opened it carefully, a blank canvas. 3 unused paintbrushes tied together with string. He looked at them, then at Celeste. She didn't say a word, just smiled. At 67:30, Leo walked toward his grandfather, the man whose voice once echoed like a war drum in a child's bones. "Do you want to paint something?" he asked. The words weren't casual. They were permission, an invitation. Celeste held her breath. Her father hesitated, then nodded. He sat beside Leo on the grass. The canvas lay flat. Leo dipped the brush into red, first made a loose shape, then handed it to the old man. A pause. Then slowly he added a line beside Leo's. Nothing fancy, nothing perfect. But it was a brush stroke. Not a slap, not a raised voice. Just color. At 6900, Celeste stepped inside for a moment, eyes burning. The past was still there in scars, in echoes, but this was new. Not a rewrite, but a next chapter. And as Leo laughed under the sun paint on his hands and no fear in his eyes, Celeste knew. The legacy had shifted. The next generation would not inherit silence. At 7001, the room was different now. No more peeling wallpaper. No more deadbolt on the outside. No mattress on the floor. No echo of punishments muffled by plaster walls. Celeste stood at the doorway of her childhood prison. But now Leo's name was on the door, painted in wild brush strokes. His colors, his laughter echoing from the corners. This was his studio, his world. At 7100, she stepped inside quietly. The light filtered in through a curtain she'd sewn herself, patterned with bright clouds and crooked stars. Leo's easel stood in the center of the room, surrounded by markers, paint canvases. But it wasn't the art that made her stop. It was what hung above his desk, in a simple black frame, velvet matting, no gold, no drama, just one item. A rusted key. Underneath it, Leo had lettered carefully in blue crayon, for the one brave enough to unlock themselves. At 7130, her hand touched the glass gently. The key hadn't changed, but she had. This wasn't a monument to pain. It was a declaration. By 7230, Celeste set up her camera, a soft lamp behind her, no filter, no script, just a voice. "I'm not here to punish anyone," she said, looking straight into the lens. "I'm here because silence was killing me, and it kills others too." The video wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, no sensationalist edits, just a woman with tired eyes and a steady voice. "I used to believe I was the only one. That something in me had been broken, too sensitive, too dramatic, too disobedient to deserve love." A pause. "But the truth is, love without respect is not love. And discipline without empathy is not parenting. It's control." At 7400, her voice broke once. She didn't edit it out. "I forgive them, but I will not forget. I don't want anyone to forget." She looked down at her hands, open, unshaking. "I'm raising a child who isn't afraid to ask questions, to say no, to cry, because I want him to know that his emotions are not weapons, they're maps, and I will never throw those maps away." By 7600, the camera held still as Celeste leaned forward, eyes calm. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want awareness. I want the cycle to end here, with me." Then she smiled, not a triumphant smile, a release. On screen, her image slowly faded to black, and white letters appeared over a quiet humming score. "They don't have to be the enemy if they choose to change, but we have the right to lock that door forever." And underneath that, a final whisper. "For every child who was told to be quiet, this is your key now.